Hello, this channel is called Flying with Spinner and is intended to help new pilots to DCS become familiar with the different aircraft and helicopters, but primarily taking the mystery out of how to get started with DCS, and we'll be covering many of the basics for each of the aircraft. So without saying anything further, let's get started with the P47.
You may fly the planned route or just explore the area. There are no threats.
As you can hear, I'm using the standard instant mission that DCS has. The aircraft is set up and running. What I'm actually going to do, though, is close the canopy. Ordinarily, you wouldn't do that. You'd leave the canopy open on a lot of aircraft for takeoff. I'm closing it so that we can control the amount of sound coming from the aircraft and you can hear me. One of the other things I'm going to do is decouple the boost from the throttle, and there's a switch down there that I just clicked on to actually do that. As we're going to stay in the circuit, we want to make sure that the altimeter is actually reading airfield elevation. And the other thing I'm going to do is just make sure that the directional indicator matches the runway heading, which is 06. We'll reset the horizon again to make sure that that's level. Not that we'll be using it in today's flight. Now I've made sure the prop is all the way forward. The tail wheel needs to be locked. Here's the tail wheel. Here we need that locked, so it will help us go straight. Now as we start the roll, I'm going to just hold the stick slightly back. As it starts to move forward and we start to get airflow over the tail surfaces, I'm just going to ease the stick forward slightly just to lift the tail up and allow the aircraft to run forward and slowly move up and become airborne. In other words, I don't want it to lurch into the sky. I'm going to have a slight amount of right rudder. I don't know if you can actually see that, but I have right rudder in. So, okay, let's put in the throttle now. Now I'm going to go to 41 inches, 42 inches, somewhere in that area. So we're going to stay in the green. The aircraft is running now. I'm putting forward pressure on the airplane, on the stick. Nose is coming down. I'm allowing the speed to build. The aircraft is off the ground. Now at 150 knots, I'm going to bring the gear up. You can see the red light is on. That means that gear's in transition. And we're just going to let the aircraft build up speed until we get to 200 knots. Notice I'm not climbing too quickly. Okay, we're at 200 knots. The gear's out of transition. I'm going to bring the prop back to 25, and I'm going to start a gentle right turn, climbing the aircraft, keeping the airspeed at 200 knots. That should establish about a 2,000 feet a minute climb. Now, I'm just checking the instruments. I'm making sure that temperatures and pressures are where they should be. We've got the prop set at 25. We're at 40 inches of manifold pressure. Nose is getting a bit high. The aircraft's getting a bit slow, so I'm dropping the nose slightly to regain 200 knots. Now right now we're doing a right-hand circuit. Typically, if you're staying in the circuit, it would be a left-hand circuit. We'll be going both ways today. And as you can see, we're coming abeam the airfield. And we're going to climb on up to about 3,000 feet above the height of the airfield. Now as we approach it, I'm going to bring the throttle back to 25 inches. So we've got 25 inches of manifold pressure on the throttle, and the prop is set to an RPM of 25. So 25, 25. I don't want the aircraft to sink. I'm at 3,000 feet. We're now going to bring the throttle back to 17 inches because we're going to start our descent back to the airport to do a touch and go. With the same, I'm going to put the prop forward. Now why would I do that? That helps to provide some braking and also helps to set the aircraft up for us to be able to continue the roll and take off again after the landing. We're under 200 knots, so I'm bringing the gear down, and I'm also going to drop the flaps. Now I'm not going to do a straight-in approach to the runway. As you can see, I'm taking a curved approach into the runway, and the reason for that is I get better visibility of the runway. If I get a little low and slow, the nose will get high and I won't be able to see over the nose and see that the runway is clear. My speed is coming back now to 150 knots. I've got a very clear view of the runway. It's not obstructed at all. I can see whether any aircraft are coming on or leaving the runway. Now, normally the canopy would be back. I'm not going to do that for this video. But notice I'm not changing the throttle a whole lot. I'm not touching it at all, actually. I'm just bringing the aircraft in a curved approach into the runway, and everything's perfectly easy for me to see. I can see the runway. The nose is not obstructing the runway. I'm lining up now. Haven't touched the throttle once. Now as we go over the threshold, I'm going to flight idle, and I'm just going to let the airplane float down the runway, gradually bringing the nose up so it lands in the 3-point attitude. By that I mean the front wheels and the tail wheel touching at the same time. So we're going to bring the flaps up. We're going to make sure the prop is all the way forward. We're going to apply power again. We're going to go to 41, 42 inches of manifold pressure. Ease the back pressure off the stick, forward slightly, let the airplane come up into the air, and we're airborne again. Wait for a positive increase in speed and climb. Let's take the gear up, check that the flaps are actually up, the gear's in transition. Wait until we get to 200 knots. We're approaching 200 knots now. So we're going to bring the prop back to 25, and we're going to climb the aircraft at 200 knots in a left turn. And as you can see, we've got 2,000 feet a minute. If you can't, we do. 200 knots. So at 40 inches, we're getting a nice climb rate at 200 knots. That gives you, on average, about 2,000 feet a minute. That means nothing's happening too quickly. You're able to fly the circuit without things getting ahead of you. We're approaching 2,000 feet. The nice thing about this climb rate is it keeps me through most of the circuit at an altitude where if I had an engine failure, I can fly back to the airport or the airfield and land on the airfield. If not on the runway, I can get back to the airfield. And I'm going to show you that as the video progresses. So here we are, we're climbing up. I've let the aircraft get a little bit too fast, and that's why I'm not at 3,000 feet at this point. Now as we approach 3,000 feet, bring the throttle back to 25. So throttle's at 25, props at 25, level flight. Now as we beam the threshold, what we're going to do is take the throttle all the way back down to 1700. Don't turn yet until we've got the aircraft speed down to 200 knots. You mustn't let the nose drop or you'll never get the speed back to 200 knots. Right, the gear is coming down. I'm going to let the flaps come down, and I'm going to put the pitch forward. So prop lever full forward. And now I'm going to do a turning approach or curved approach into the threshold of the runway. The speed will start to bleed off. The speed should drop back to 150 knots, which is what we want. I'm pulling the throttle back ever so slightly. I don't want to get too far out because I'll end up having to put power back in. Now, one of the things that's important with an aeroplane like this, or any piston engine aeroplane, is not to thrash the throttle around when you're on final approach. Now, something interesting has happened. I'm looking at my speed. The airplane's really not slowing down. I'm checking around to find out why, and the flaps didn't go down. So what we're going to do is simply bring the gear up, and we're going to overshoot. And we're going to do that by bringing the RPM back up to the manifold pressure, back up to 25. So we're 25, 25. Now, interestingly enough, the flaps didn't come down when I was expecting them to. I did switch them to come down, but I've noticed with the Warthog that I'm using as a throttle quadrant, if I flick the flap switch too quickly, the flaps don't come down. Anyhow, we'll move back up to 41 inches of manifold pressure, and we'll just fly the circuit again. Gear is up. We'll climb out at 200 knots. So what happened there? As I was coming in on the approach, the airplane wasn't slowing down. That got my attention. The numbers weren't working out. As I looked over the wing, I could see the flaps weren't down. And obviously the airplane's has a lot less drag than I was expecting, which is why it wasn't slowing down and it was staying at around 200 knots. When you fly patterns and you fly them consistently, as we are now, so 40 inches of manifold pressure, we've got the prop full forward. I'm going to bring it back to 25 now, and we climb at 200 knots. We're going to expect a certain climb rate. We're going to expect the airplane to perform in a particular way. Okay, I'm bringing the throttle back right now, so we're now at 25, 25. Level flight at 3,000. As I was saying, we expect the airplane to perform in a certain way, and when it doesn't, that should immediately cause you to look around the aircraft to see what's not working out. Now, whether you are a experienced pilot or not, the same rule applies. You're going to look around the aircraft and you're going to look for things that are not where they should be, if the numbers aren't working out. So here we are, we've just passed a beam, the threshold. I'm coming back down to 1700 RPM. I'm going to keep the airplane from descending, so the speed drops off. As soon as it hits 200 knots, I can bring the gear down and I can bring the flaps down. Now I'm watching them this time and I'm seeing that they're actually making their way down. So, looking at the airfield, we're going to take a curved approach into the airfield. Now I can see the speed has immediately come back down to 150 knots, and we're going to want to keep it at 150 knots. What we don't want to see is that speed getting slow, you getting low, adding power, essentially dragging the airplane in low and slow. You can't see what's ahead of you, you can't see the runway clearly, you can't see obstacles on the runway, and also in a real-world airplane it's dangerous. In DCS it gets embarrassing if you crash because you land short of the runway or something like that. So here we are, 25. I'm gonna push the prop forward. So the prop now is just slightly ahead at 25. The manifold pressure is 16, 17. The airspeed is 150. 150 is a great approach speed for this airplane. Now notice the angle again. I'm looking ahead. I can see that the runway is clear. There's no obstacles. Now I don't know if you've noticed on the last overshoot that there were some aircraft actually on the taxiway. Now I'm having to add some power in. So I'm at 25 inches of manifold because we started getting low and slow. We're back up to 150 again. I'm bringing the power back just below 20, back down to 17 inches of manifold pressure. As we go over the threshold, I bring it back to flight idle. Now what I'm going to do is allow the airplane to float, pulling the nose up so we land in the 3-point attitude. Alright, flaps are going up. I can see that they actually are. Prop is all the way forward. Let's put the power back in. I've got some right rudder to keep the airplane going straight. Neutral on the stick. Slight forward pressure. Speed's coming up. The airplane is airborne. Let the speed continue to increase. Positive rate of climb. Gear up. See that the gear is in transition. It is. The red light is actually on. Let the airplane continue to accelerate up to 200 knots. As it accelerates to 200 knots, let's just bring the prop back to 25, and we're going to start a climbing right turn again at 200 knots. The rate of climb is just around 2,000 feet a minute, slightly under. We're going to check to make sure the flaps are up, the gear isn't in transition, it's up. Everything's looking good. We're in balanced flight, meaning that the rudder is balancing out the torque, it's balanced with the turn. I'm allowing the airplane to get a little bit too fast, so I'm lifting the nose. Again, we're at 200 knots. Okay, so we're going to do something slightly different on this particular pass. When we're about as far away from the airfield as we can get, we'll simulate an engine failure. And then we'll head back to the airfield with a failed engine and see how that works out. A little bit more power to keep the airplane climbing. Now as you climb, the air pressure drops, meaning that you're going to lose power and you're going to need to add more throttle. Eventually you'd need to add boost if you wanted to keep your power up. Right, we're at 3,000 feet. I'm going to bring the airplane back to 25. We're abeam the airfield. Oh, we've had an engine failure. Now, one of the first things we're going to do with an engine failure, even before we try and understand why we've had an engine failure, is turn into the airfield. Once we've turned into the airfield, I'm going to look around and see why the engine stopped. I don't know. I'm going to feather the prop. Now, I don't know if that's modeled in DCS yet, but by feathering the prop, I'm reducing the drag of the airplane. We're below 200 knots, so I'm going to drop the gear. And because we're close into the airfield, I'm going to drop the flaps as well. Now you can see we were a long way out, but look how we've been able to get in above the airfield, essentially just as a glider. Now what I'm trying to do right now is just plan my approach. And I'm not planning my approach to land at the threshold of the runway. I'm looking at my landing in the center of the airfield. Therefore, if I get it wrong, I've got an undershoot runway and I've got overshoot runway. Now, right now, I think I'm a little too high, so I'm going to either S it off by going back and forth, or I can side slip the aircraft. And I'm just S-ing off the extra height right now. Not letting the airplane get too slow. Okay. Now as I come in now, I'm going to let it float on and do a normal three-point landing. And there we are. So prop forward, flaps up, power up, and I believe we've got enough runway ahead of us to get off the ground and do another circuit. And there we are, we're off the ground. Okay, let the speed positively increase. It's approaching 150 knots. The flaps are still down. Let's make sure they go up properly. They are. That's a control switching problem that I have. Okay, gear up. Going to allow the speed to increase to 200 knots. There's the 200 knots. Back to 25 on the prop. Start a climbing right turn. Now again, because I fly the numbers on this aircraft, they're my numbers. You can fly the airplane the way that suits you, but know your numbers. I could see that the airplane wasn't accelerating correctly. I looked out over the wing to check the flaps, which I always would do anyhow, and I could see the flaps were still down. Now you heard me say flaps up. When I said flaps up, I hit the switch. I toggled it too quickly. That causes it not to work correctly, and the flaps didn't come up. But again, it's a good example to show you why flying the numbers can be very, very helpful. Okay, great. Well, we're climbing past 2,000 feet, 25 inches on the prop. A little bit more power in right now, 40 inches of manifold pressure, 200 knots. Now, if this is sounding repetitive and boring, great. If you can remember the numbers, you'll find it very, very helpful. Now, this time, what we're actually going to do is we're going to do a different approach. We're going to approach into the overhead, and then we're going to do a left-hand brake, a mid-airfield brake, which is pretty typical. Alright, we're going to come back to 2525. We're going to stay in level flight, and we're going to relax a little bit. Now, just take a look at that side picture out there, the airfield. If I have an engine failure, I can make it back. I can make it back easily. The same thing's going to be true when we do the overhead brake. We'll do an overhead brake, we'll come into land, we'll fly around again, and then we'll do an overhead brake with an engine failure. And I'll show you how you can get back to the airfield if you do it right. Now I'm going to extend a little further than I have in the past, because we are going to want to fly down the center line of the approach and then down the runway before we do the left brake. Now we're level, as you can see, 2525. We've got about 240 knots indicated as we fly along here. We'll fly out past the winding river here, and then we'll make our turn in. Now when I did that last approach, because it was an engine failure, you definitely want to open the canopy, because if the landing doesn't work out very well and you do crash, then you want someone to be able to get you out of the aircraft, at least in the real world. And the problem you've got, of course, through inference is the canopies will jam because the airframe is bent, and then no one can get you out. You sit in there, and the outcome can be very unpleasant. Okay, I'm going to bring the manifold pressure down to 20 inches. There's the airfield back there. Now I'm lining up on the center line of the approach, and we're just going to fly the approach down to the airfield, or down to the threshold of the runway. Now you can see I'm keeping my speed up, which means I don't have a high angle of attack. I don't have a nose pitched high. I can observe the airfield, I can observe the runway, I can observe the traffic pattern as I come in. So 20 inches, 2500 RPM on the engine. Now we're going to want to approach the airfield, and a bit like approaching an aircraft carrier, I'm going to level out at 800 feet. And here we are, we're at 800 feet. There's no need to go any lower than this. And we're going to fly down the center line of the runway to the midpoint, and then we will start the overhead brake. So I can see the control tower. That's going to be my visual point for the brake. Here we are, we're at the brake. I'm climbing up now, and I'm doing a climbing left turn, and I want the turn to bring my speed back so I can drop my gear. That's coming down. I'm going to hold off a little bit on bringing the flaps down. I've put the prop all the way forward, and we're just turning the airplane around 150. Looks good. We've got 20 inches, props all the way forward, 150 knots, the gear's down. I'm descending slightly, which is fine. And we're still at 150 knots. We're going to continue flying forward until we're abeam the threshold of the runway. We're at 1,000 feet now above the airfield. We're going to start our turn in, and now I'm going to start the flaps coming down. Now we're going to have a continuous turn coming in. And you can see here, if I had an engine failure at any point, I could make it back to the airfield. And one of the things I'm not doing is shock cooling the engine, which can cause a failure as I'm coming in to approach. I'm slowing the engine down slowly, I'm letting it cool evenly. I'm too slow, so I'm bringing the power back up again. Don't let the aeroplane get too slow, so we're at 25 inches. Coming back to 20 inches. 40 inches. Speed's increasing. There we are. So we're approaching 150 knots. Gear up, check that flaps are up, and you should be getting to know the routine by now. So we're going to fly out till we get to 200 knots. Excuse me. We're going to then bring the prop back to 25, start our climbing turn. Now I've noticed something. It may be a bug because of early access, but something very odd happens when I turn recording on. The simulator behaves as if I've got a crosswind. If I turn recording off, I don't have a crosswind. So something very interesting is going on with the software when I am recording, and I'm recording in VR. Alright, so we're going to continue the climb. 40 inches of manifold pressure, 25 on the prop, 200 knots, balanced flight. And maybe that's why I keep going out of balanced flight, that there's just something a little strange happening when I'm recording. It's not me, I promise. Alright, little fast, bring the nose up. And as you can see, I'm making mistakes all the time, but I'm correcting them. I'm keeping my eye on what's going on and continuing to correct the problems so that I fly the aircraft on the numbers. One of the benefits of doing that, of course, is if something is wrong with the aircraft, for instance, the flaps haven't retracted, the gear didn't come up or the gear didn't come down, the numbers will look wrong to you because you're used to seeing, when you fly a pattern in this way, you're used to seeing a particular set of numbers. And if you fly it the same way every time, if your aircraft is damaged and you can't visually see what the damage is, you will notice it immediately when the numbers don't work out. So here we are, cruising level flight at 25. That gives us about 240 knots. I'm descending slightly, which I don't want to do, so I'm picking the nose up to maintain level flight and to stay at the target 3,000 feet. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to fly the approach again, and this time we'll have an engine failure in the brake, and I'll show you that you can get back to the airfield even in a brake, and especially in a brake. Now, one of the things I've been noticing when I do the brake at 800 feet with 20 inches I'm not regaining as much height as I would like to. So over time, I'm going to start adjusting how I do that. I might have 25 inches of manifold pressure in. I might do the brake at 1,000 feet. And really what I want to do is know that if the engine fails, I can comfortably get back to the airfield or finish my approach. So here we are, a little bit late in my turn in, but we can sort that out. Very late, in fact, in my turn in. Here we go. So fly the airplane down the approach. We're going to come back to 20 inches. We're going to push the prop forward. And because, like you, I'm learning, I'm not going to descend below 1,000 feet this time. I'm going to start my brake at 1,000 feet above the airfield. So we're approaching 1,000 feet, so we're going to get ready to level out. And this is why it was so important to set the altimeter to height above airfield, so we zero it at the time of taking off. Okay, we're at 1,000 feet. Props forward, 20 inches of manifold pressure. We're going to fly over the tower and start our brake. Here we go. Over the tower, climbing up. 200 knots. Okay, I'm going to bring the gear down. I'm going to allow the airplane to continue decelerating until it gets to 150 knots. And we have an engine failure. So I'm going to feather the prop, assuming it's not going to start. And I'm going to plan my approach. Now remember, I'm looking at my touchdown point at being somewhere near the middle of the airfield, not at the beginning of the threshold here. Now, if I can do it in the beginning, I will, but now at this point, I'm going to bring my flaps down. So they're coming down. Okay, 150 knots. Plenty of runway ahead. Bring it back into the 3-point position as before, so it's just normal landing. And there we are, on the ground. Back pressure on the stick until the airplane comes to a complete stop. And there you are, just to prove that I really did turn the engine all the way off.